For my third year project, I have focused on the sartorial narratives that are held within our clothing, breaking apart their material and abstract context in order to create better relationships towards them. Though clothes are culturally determined, they do not become significant through culture alone. They become significant through personal use and human ownership. For me, this is an important project to embark upon, as our relationship and care towards our clothes has suffered in the face of fast fashion. Necessity and function create long-lasting relationships with our clothing, whereas accessibility doesn't so much, a modern-day convenience that has tempted us to establish fleeting interactions with our clothes, creating vast amounts of waste and textile pollution. I have deconstructed, physically and theoretically, old clothes to determine how I can form deadstock fabrics and textiles into new articles of clothing, whilst maintaining the characters and stories that are already woven into them. Fundamentally, novelty is always a driver. We associate new with worth, but we still like novel and we shouldn't have to forego this. My challenge was to create a collection that lived by the set of rules, to create a more sustainable manufacturing method, ultimately designing a brand concept transparent in what the clothes are made from by following the material components from owner to owner from start to finish. With clothes my focus, but my access to fabrics and textiles limited in lockdown, I focused on clothes I already had, in addition to what people were donating and throwing away, taking advantage of the COVID clearouts. I began to remember and map out where I wore certain things, where I was, where I got it, who I was with, and so on, the clothes working as visual signifiers to my past. This started conversations with others around me who did the same. The stories gave character and personality to the clothing, especially the unwanted ones, which could go on to serve a new purpose to somebody else, further expanding their story and material culture. I was inspired by the creatives who gave inherent meaning and worth to their clothes, through means of collaboration, philanthropic endeavour, or by exploring their heritage, their outcomes encouraging sustainable manufacture. Fashion designers Cypria Lilly and Bethany Williams are the poster girls for ethically made slow fashion brands, engaging communities and charitable pathways that bring about positive change aimed at young consumers. Meanwhile, stylist Charlotte James echoes this in her creative direction. Netflix documentary series Worn Stories and podcast Everything is Alive debunk the importance of giving meaning to our objects, examining how personal significance can create social significance and change. I began to gather more formal stories through recording podcast interviews conducted with a variety of ages, sexes, and ethnicities to develop an inclusive and expansive story bank. The questions were varied, from asking people to define their style to choosing 5 sentimental items and telling me where they are worn. I needed to gauge an understanding of how people felt about their clothing in order to turn this into a selling point. I knew not every item would have profound meaning, but some did, and most of those who partook could remember where most items had been worn, which in itself provided some form of narrative. Some found the project more interesting than others, but the reaction towards the questions were majoritively enthusiastic, confirming to me that people were interested. I love second-hand clothing purely for the fact that someone has had this before me. I could be wearing a t-shirt that someone wore on a first date with their now spouse, or I could be swinging a bag that used to be a part of somebody's Sunday best. These stories can be used as tools in rebuilding our treasured and savoured relationships with our clothes. These cultural artefacts become embodied in our lives the way the rest of our belongings do, and I find it so interesting to try and discover or look into our material surroundings and previous ownership. This is how I coined the idea of the ID cards, to visually serve this purpose. During my making process, I began to call my project threads, inspired by the word's definition, a characteristic running throughout a situation, emblematic of the project's initiative in providing identity through material narratives. It is not a postmodern attempt to revive old fashion, dealing in abstract couture terms. It is instead an alternative manufacturing model that applies the use of old materials in order to help provide young consumers a shopping solution that seeks to ensure the greener fashion economy that they want. I have produced sample garments and designed the blueprints for their patterns so that manufacturers could adapt them in order to create simple but limitless combinations and outcomes. The brand I have produced is only in the foundational stage of what could be sustained and thrive in a market of consumers interested in sustainable clothing. The brand was and still is yet to be immersed into the outside world, and I'd like to know what people's responses were to my proposed solution. I produced a photo series of the garments shot in a slightly dated but familiar setting to form a soft juxtaposition and draw a reference towards the modern clothing and the old material components used. For the exhibition, I am documenting these photos through a film and physical zine, collage with the photos of the individual garments, the ID cards, samples, sketches, old photos, and notes. The aim of my outcome is to encourage the onlooker to consider material value and stories within their old clothes, finding the magic and creativity in this method of manufacture. So this part is a little less scripted, but I'd like to talk to you about the magazine that I made, or the zine that I have made, that should hopefully look to explain to you the process that I went through to get my results, and also look at how I have tried to formulate some kind of sustainable brand or sort of sustainable manifesto for future design using deconstructed and reconstructed clothing. So to begin with, I looked at statistics. At the top, you can see that by 2030, it's expected that there will be 148 million tonnes of waste. Already, there is 140 million pounds of clothing that goes to waste every year, while 3 out of 5 new items of clothing are thrown away and incinerated in 1 year of purchase. And in the UK alone, 20% of this ends up going to landfill, whilst 80% ends up being incinerated. Encouragingly, 60% of millennials say that they want to shop more sustainably. However, worldwide, clothing utilisation has dropped 36% compared to how much we used to use our clothes 15 years ago, and 1/4 of the industry resources are wasted as fabric and garment leftovers, and under 1% of the material used to produce clothing is recycled into new clothing at the end of its life. This next bit is all about my deconstruction process. So I gathered loads of unwanted fabrics, so I either collected them from people who didn't want them, fly tipped them, got them from charity shops, my own wardrobe, just accumulated a lot of old unwanted fabric. And then I deconstructed them into piles and categorized them depending on their fabric, their colour, where they were from, synthetic, natural, basically subcategorized them as much as I could. I basically tried to get a feel of how I could give them a sort of lease of new life. So through just deconstructing them, I also started to remember where they were worn, or something about them, like a piece of trivia, or sort of try to unlock a memory that the clothing has encouraged me to think about. In the process, I gauged how the use of multiple fabrics might pose as a hindrance to manufacturers, as most patterns only account for the use of one fabric that feels and looks the same. Therefore, I didn't use any commercial patterns in the process because they couldn't accommodate such a variety of mixed fabrics, so the combination of old narratives. I designed true-to-size paper patterns for each garment made, the patterns simple enough to be compatible with most fabrics and colourways. So here you can see me looking at the Patchwork Skater pattern pieces and the Patchwork Skater outcome, which is just one of the skirts I designed. Designed it to have pleats because it would enable me to make a longer skirt, which could use different pieces of fabric within the panelling, which gave me an excuse to use even more of the fabric, leaving no scraps. I should probably point out that the reason I have put brown tape over the faces of the individuals used is to sort of derive from the personal identity and give identity and personification to the clothing. That's purely what's going on here, but I think I didn't want to oversaturate the project with identity and personal stories, so I just sort of etched that out just to give more attention to the sartorial storytelling. So as you can see here, I am talking about a skirt that I called the Patchwork Skater purely because it is a patchworked skater skirt, and I'm talking about the different ID cards that we used to make it. So we have a combination of fly tip fabrics found on my old road in London. We have fabric scraps that I found in a textiles drawer, and I think it's a deconstructed top that I wore when I was in sixth form. The ID cards were made so that people could sort of use them as care labels in identifying where the previous fabric came from, which I hoped would create a more transparent relationship between sustainability between consumer and manufacturer. The top was shirred using elastic to give it that sort of crinkled, bleached effect, which looks totally different to the original. So this is like a slip dress that I made. I wanted to use this green skirt that I've had for ages and pair it with these green gloves, which were my grandma's, and I thought they were fantastic. So I used sort of cording and boning for the sides, and then fabric cutouts for the flowers and that green skirt, which created the dress figure silhouette, I suppose. So you can see the sketches that I made, which were original mock-ups, and then the fabrics used for the flowers, which I sewed on, made from a variety of scraps as to make sure nothing went to waste. And then you've got the car boot sale cording that I found for a couple of, I think it was 50p. So with this collage, I think it's really clear to tell the sort of story from start to finish, which is the aim of these collaged pages in the zine. So I'm telling you more about like the fabric origins and how they kind of came to be, which I think provides a really beautiful insight into the outcome of how multiple combined fabrics can create something entirely new from what they originally were. I'm also talking about how I've got loads of dead stock from Italy, which I found in a Hackney warehouse, which has obviously come all the way from there, because it's the mapping out and looking at the origins of where everything has come from and how it's like come to be into this one new garment, which is purely the essence of the deconstructed storytelling that I've tried to achieve. So I've got this letter from my gran, which is explaining that the lace used is 25 years old and was used as the bridesmaid's dress of her wedding, which is a very sort of sentimental, nostalgic piece of fabric for me, perhaps. And it was used to sort of reconfigure into a top, so something completely and entirely different to what it was originally used for. Keeping notes and like small tidbits from interviews that I conducted with people in order to gather these stories, I think really helps other people gauge and understand the concept of my project and was really useful in the research process. So on this page, I'm talking about another skirt that I made, and a little bit different to the other one. So the fabric I found was actually fly tipped outside of my old house in New Cross, and it's beautiful champagne silk that I've used. It's really coarse and amazing quality, so I was really lucky to find that, as was the two panelling that I just pointed out. So looking at the ID cards, so one of them was a skirt that I used as the sort of structure for this new skirt, so using the zipper and the sort of A-line cut. And then I also digital embroidered this logo to go on the front, because I felt that it was quite nice to sort of stamp these items as new. I also really love external embroidery on items, so I wanted to include this within my own work. So for me, the sketching process was also really important because I needed to come up with designs that could include as many of the old fabrics as possible, and also kind of try and contemporize them because some of the fabrics were a little outdated. So just looking at how I can sort of like layer stuff up, people quite like the patchworked and mismatched fabric look, and I really like it myself, so it was really fun to experiment with these. I think also this is my favourite piece that I made just because of the wearability of it and like the simplicity. I just think it looks quite nice. I like the contemporary's take on like a tank or like a sort of corsety bardo top. I think perhaps this one might be the most interesting because I sort of used deconstructed and chopped up dead stock fabrics as the wadding within the gilet that I've made, because I didn't want to use anything that was new, and I wanted to make like an eco-conscious, sustainable way of making sort of wadding and insulation within coats and clothing. So everything chopped up that you can see inside, which is probably more visible if sort of light can shine through it. You can see that the chopped up sort of confetti-like fabric that I've used, and it worked really well. So to make it, I just put loads of Bonder web between the two pieces of fabric, so the lining and the outer layer, and then I just ironed on the chopped up fabric that I made so it stuck, and then I just sewed these sort of like quilted swirls down just to keep them in place. And I think aesthetically it looks quite attractive, and it's just like completely zero waste, completely resourceful way of using leftover scraps so nothing went to waste from the offcuts of other pieces. Here I'm also looking at how the samples enabled me to come up with the design for this, just by playing around with the different fabrics, whether to use Bonder web or not, what scraps worked the best, what quilting method worked the best, and it just helped to enable me to come up with the final product. And this was probably the most fun to make. It was really experimental, and I think actually worked really, really well. So now is probably a good time to talk about the ID cards in a little bit more detail, so I think I'll read them out to you. So here we have an Italian dress dead stock. It's nylon, vintage dead stock, picked up from a warehouse in Hackney. This is fly tip fabric from Jenningham Road, where I used to live, collected from a house in Telegraph Hill, fly tipped fabric, offcuts from Savile Row. This is Italian dress stock, fine knit merino, a vintage dead stock picked up from a warehouse in Hackney. And I talk about this bridesmaid's dress lace, which was worn at a wedding as part of the bridesmaid's dress, and couple have just celebrated 25 years, which takes me back to the letter and the package from my grandma earlier, just to give a little bit more of an insight into that origin, how it's come to be into this new item. So I think it's also really important to explain how my ID cards operate and like the importance of actually using them. So I designed the cards to be half the size of paper ones that I originally made in my sort of conceptualization process, and provided short snippets of trivia surrounding the garment's origins obtained at the beginning of the project through either interviews or my own experience. I used the labs to sublimation print these ID cards onto fabric so I could attach them to the clothes, making sort of brand-like labels so they look professional and also a little bit more attractive. I chose to fasten them inside the garment so they would operate as care labels, figuratively delivering the message of careful and mindful consumption, a transparent way of telling the consumer or the onlooker what went into their clothing, where it came from, encouraging sustainable behaviours and relationships. There's also an element of upcycling that went into the project, so I used like this old skirt here, this blue one, to be the framework of the A-line cut, just because it was an easier way of getting the shape that I wanted. And here is the silk again to create a really firm body to the bottom of the skirt, keeping its shape. As you can see, a lot of the fabrics here were used multiple times because I had either a lot of it or it worked well on multiple items, and that's okay because it ensured that no scraps went to waste and that I was able to use every last piece of dead stock fabric and old clothes. As previously mentioned, this skirt was designed because I was able to use paneling with the pleats that enabled me to use multiple fabrics for the skirt length. And it also added a really lovely aesthetic, which I manipulated further by bleaching and then pleating and then ruching at the back. So here I'm explaining to you that the lining was from an Adidas jacket, which was polyester and bought in Camden Market in the early 2000s. And then there was also this lovely Noisy May dress, which is polyester, and previous owner wore this to the sixth form graduation, which is used as the paneling there in the middle. I have already mentioned this, but this pattern was designed with this outcome in mind so that I could use these multiple fabrics within the skirt length. So it was just sort of thinking about stuff that I could come up with that could accommodate all of these different fabrics. So going forward, I think I'd read some more ID cards out to you. So we've got the Topshop vest at the top there, which is polyester. Previous owner dyed the vest grey, then pink, then navy. So versatile for sure. M&S woolen vest, wool. Previous owner wore this to work as part of her job uniform as she worked in the jewellers in Blackwood, Wales. And then we've got the ASOS design jumper, which is acrylic. Previous owner recalls wearing this jumper on her first legal pub outing. And then basketball tee, cotton, bought in a charity shop in Somerset, worn to climb Lion's Head Mountain in South Africa. And then at the bottom there, we've got the fly tip sheets, which are cotton and collects outside a house in Telegraph Hill. So a really multi-narrative driven outcome there. I think it's also really important for me to explain why I wanted to create items and new reconfigured clothes. So I prefer the idea of having multiple stories intertwined, creating an entirely new item and sort of an entanglement of stories. I lost any notion of nostalgia or sentimentality from the project, so I got rid of any personal significance to allow the concept to grow, focusing on the stories as secular entities, faced with the risk of it becoming more of an archive. I wanted to project these narratives from the individuals onto the clothes, else it would reduce the reach of the project. So that's why there's no names mentioned and it's completely anonymous. I really wanted to include exposed patchwork, mismatched fabrics, asymmetrical cuts and textural surfaces because they look reworked, and the visually upcycled trend is very popular. Here I'm also explaining the shared two-piece that I made, which could go with the skirt but could obviously be mismatched with any of the other items but just look quite nice. For this final piece, I'll just read out some more ID cards for you so you can get an even better understanding. So we've got this Topshop maxi skirt, which is polyester. Previous owner wore this on holiday to Mallorca, Croatia, Denmark and Sardinia. And then we've got the vintage Gap fleece, brought on a family holiday to Cornwall after a unsurprisingly freezing stay in British summertime. Adidas jacket again, which I mentioned on the other skirt. And then we've got the Italian dress stock, which is taffeta, and vintage dead stock picked up from a warehouse in Hackney. And then you've got that car boot cording. For me, this entire project has been coming up with and conceptualizing a new way of sustainable manufacturing practice, and also providing a solution out there for a market that's saturated with greenwashing and sustainable movements, in inverted commas. And also just looking at a new creative way of how we can make this fun and develop a more transparent process and relationship for everybody involved. In the show, you'll see my little zine that I've just explained, some photos from the photo series but developed, my ID cards in the physical form, and some of the samples I've made alongside some of the fabric I deconstructed. I hope that this way of reconstruction and appreciation of old items and the creation of new can become a viable manufacturing method, and that giving identity to these material components creates a way of social reflection and mindful consumption. This is just one more attempt to make a stamp, but hopefully in the right direction. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer. If you'd like to see more of the process, please go to my Tumblr blog as seen on my business card here. Thank you!